Hey there, Hour of History podcast listeners, and welcome to 2020. It's a new year, and we have a great way to start the new year. I have Ferenc Laczó, who is a professor at University of Maastricht. He works on all sorts of interesting topics. He's publishing, it seems, all the time. His newest work is an edited volume called The Legacy of Division, East and West After 1989. So, true to form, true to Hour of History style, we are looking back for the new year, doing some historical analysis with an expert on Eastern Europe and European history. It's a fascinating conversation and one that I enjoyed thoroughly. Full disclaimer, Ferenc and I were both fellows at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum just this last year, and it was the start of a great friendship, I think, and I think you'll be able to hear that in the conversation. It's both enlightening and fun, something for you to kick off your new year with. Thanks again for listening to the Hour of History. There's more information, as always, at hourofhistory.com. We appreciate your comments, your subscriptions, and your sharing. What did this episode mean to you? It certainly meant a lot to us, and it will help us learn more about Europe's past and Europe's future. On the Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place. Enjoy.
You're listening to the Hour of History podcast, Our World.
Anytime, any place.
For show notes, the Hour of History blog, and more, head over to hourofhistory.com. For book recommendations about topics mentioned during the podcast, head over to hourofhistory.com/rex. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. Without further delay, the Hour of History starts right now.
So it's delightful to have you on the podcast, Dr. Ferenc Laczó, who just edited this volume, The Legacy of Division, East and West After 1989. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Now, there's a lot of talk, obviously, about 1989. You've had your head steeped in it for quite a while, not to mention the sort of life that you've lived. Why don't you introduce yourself for the audience?
So my name is Ferenc Laczó, and I originally grew up in Hungary. I was there until I was 18. And in that sense, this book, which is really an edited volume, and we have 35 contributors, is also really a personal project for me. Because I was, a very young person, just about to start primary school when the Berlin Wall came down. And my youth was very much defined by this process of Europeanization and Westernization of the country I was growing up in. And just when I was 18, and this is a time, I graduated from high school in 2000, so Hungary wasn't yet in the European Union, and this was the moment when here in the Netherlands, where I currently teach, there was an ambition to start international colleges in the English language, and they were handing out scholarships to people who weren't yet EU members, so people like me, and I happened to receive one of those, so I had the chance to study in Western Europe. But after my bachelor, I went back to Hungary to continue there and did my master's and my PhD at the Central European University, right? A university that has been in the news quite a lot in recent years, again, for all the wrong reasons, if you wish, because there has been a concerted attack on the institution by the Hungarian government, and they had been forced to move to Vienna. And after that, and this is also, I think, an interesting part of the story, perhaps, I moved to Germany, but I moved to the former eastern parts of Germany. So I was employed at the University of Vienna. And then after many, many years, almost 15 years of being away from the Netherlands, I returned to take up an assistant professorship here in Maastricht. So that is to say that my entire life has been sort of defined by this issue of Eastern and Western Europe and their relation. And this is why I was extremely interested in doing the project we're going to be discussing.
Yeah, and it's kind of talk about a serendipitous, I guess, that usually has a positive connotation to it, but sort of way to view this whole thing. We're talking too about thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people who have lived through similar experiences, but you have sort of an insight to the academy and sort of all of these different perspectives that have been put forth by academics. Now, in the edited volume, which you mentioned, 35 contributors, it's got a lot of perspectives. can you maybe just sort of give us, like, what is the value of that versus having sort of just one person putting forth their argument?
Yes. So again, that's a very good question, because our major sense was, and again, I'm teaching a lot in a European studies program, both on the bachelor and on the master level, and we feel that academics with their very long and erudite texts often have a hard time reaching young people who are used to different formats, also maybe shorter formats. Podcasts like yours is of course a brilliant initiative, and also we wanted to do something slightly different from the usual academic book. This is a book of 340 pages altogether, and it has 27 contributions. So of course it's easy to count that on average these are just 10, 12 page long pieces. We asked people to send us 3,000 words. Most of the contributors are academicians, some of them of the highest caliber. We also happen to have managed to include some really big names, which I'm very happy to say. But also we have, of course, people from different generations. Some are maybe younger, some are maybe less established at this point. But really our idea was that when you want to talk about East and West, you can do this on different levels. First of all, you can do it on the level of Germany, because there's a big debate right now about how the reunified Germany has actually really managed to reunify East and West. Why are there so many substantial differences even today, even after 30 years since '89? But you can of course have the same debate on the European level, and there you can do it in two different ways. You can talk about East and West within the European Union, so talking about the difference between countries like Poland and Hungary and France, the Netherlands, and other Western European states. But you can, of course, also bring it to address the question of Russia and Russia's relationship to Europe and to the European project as we know it as a whole. And of course, you can do it last but not least on the global level, right? So you can also bring in the question of what does East and West mean after '89? Then you also think about the major emerging player on the global scene, which is China, right? So this was our ambition, to do all of that, to really bring this debate about East and West and the legacy of division, the legacy of the Cold War East-West division, and to address it on these different levels at the same time.
And yeah, you can definitely see the value that would be for reaching undergraduates and graduate level students. You can highlight one of these, perhaps it's the global in the case, and talk about China in terms of 1989. But the centering sort of question of this edited volume, the how has Europe's East-West division been overcome, transformed, and reproduced since 1989 is just absolutely massive. I think the temptation academics have had in the past is to look at it from just that one perspective, perhaps Germany. What sort of prompting did you give to the contributors? Did they have a carte blanche to sort of put forth their perspective?
Yes, very much so. So, this started as an enquete. We sent out these questions and we targeted people we knew had an opinion and had some kind of personal stake in this discussion. People who have stated, who have made very interesting claims about these topics, and also we wanted to have some more personal essays in it. People whose autobiographies or whose biographies have been impacted by the evolution of the East and West, right? So we very much allowed people to develop their own argument, but then we were of course very conscious that if this was to turn out as a really interesting volume, we have to have principles of composition, right? We have to think about the number of countries that will be represented in the volume in terms of where the authors come from. We had to have of course a variety of disciplines. We have to also think of course generations, also of gender balance. And again, I think we haven't quite done perfectly well on all these accounts. I have to admit, we have sent out several more invitations than how many we have succeeded at recruiting in terms of contributions, right? We have, again, as I mentioned, 35 people made active contributions to this volume, so that's really a large number. But our original ambition was even bigger, maybe slightly crazy, but that's what we started from. We wanted to organize the largest such discussion on the anniversary of '89. So that was then, as we moved along, we sent out the first round of invitations, then we got up to 12 essays. And then we started thinking again, what is really missing? Where should we still go? What could still complement this discussion?
And that's a sign of a very strong edited volume when you get a chance to go back and do that. Now, there's a few things that loom large that seem to be, threads throughout. Obviously, we're talking since 1989, and just this concept of Russia that you mentioned before appears in almost all of the reflections.
Yes.
And so maybe you could say a few words. Russia seems to be on everyone's mind right now. What were some of the themes that you pulled out of this understanding or misunderstanding of Russia?
Exactly. So I should say that the biggest change that you can trace since '89 is the shift of the boundary between East and West. Right. If you look at it purely politically, what happens in '89 is that a substantial part of what used to be Eastern Europe, basically all the satellite states of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, plus the Baltic states that used to belong to the Soviet Union, and also parts of Yugoslavia, right, Croatia and Slovenia, they all become part of the West. They all become part of the European Union. And Russia is excluded from these structures. So there's a kind of new East-West division where the border has really shifted further to the east, but that East-West division is still there. And I often say, when you look at the transformation after '89 from the point of view of Eastern Europe, half of the countries or half of this territory becomes part of the West, but the other half doesn't, right? And there you come to cases like Georgia, cases like Ukraine, some of the most contested territories today, and some of the most controversial cases as well. And that's why I think Russia has, sort of really entered in such a prominent way into our discussion as well, because Russia is in many ways, the one state where you can still see that this East-West division is very, very relevant today. Now, we have several different opinions on Russia, just like on many other questions, and that was, of course, also part of our idea to bring together people who may not have been in a dialogue with each other in previous instances. And we start with two texts, one on Russia and one on East Central Europe, both of which are on misperception. Richard Sakwa, who's an academic based in Kent in the UK, he has a text which explains that after the end of the Cold War, when Gorbachev was very eager, in fact, to end the Cold War, right? The last Soviet leader, he was willing to let the satellite states go. He was also eager to end the Cold War contest, which the Soviets couldn't quite fight anymore. But he was, of course, very much against the implosion of the Soviet Union. And he wanted to end the Cold War in a specific way, which was to refound a greater Europe and a greater West. And this is what, again, I'm following Sakwa's argument here. He says that this hasn't quite happened. What has happened instead is that the West has expanded. The West has sort of tried to export its model, and Russia was really left out. And the backlash that we've seen under Putin, the kind of authoritarian turn of Russia, and also the anti-Western turn of Russia in more recent years, can only be understood if we go back to this moment right after the end of the Cold War, where Russians feel that they haven't quite gotten what they were bargaining for.
And like you said, so the biggest change is this shift in boundary, but you even have people in this volume who are sort of rejecting this East-West dichotomy and tying the lines underneath. What about that argument? Is it possible to reject this totally?
Precisely. So we have Jan Zielonka, who's again based at Oxford, and he contributed quite a polemical piece, which we are very, very happy to include, because he basically makes a strong argument that East and West division, the way we used to know it, no longer quite matters. He basically says that a lot of people assume it's still there. A lot of people, especially in journalism, in the mainstream media, would want to go back to cliches of East and West, also within Europe. And he who is a academic based in the UK, but who is from Poland, I think is very sensitive to this, right? That he is constantly called a post-communist, even though he was never a member of the Communist Party. He left, communist-ruled Poland at a young age, and even after so many decades, he's still kind of labeled as an Eastern European, whereas in reality, Europe is divided along many different lines. And the East-West division from the Cold War, which we have inherited sort of as a mental mapping, is not the most important. It is in fact just one of many. Now, I think this is a very serious challenge to our volume, and of course we were very open to this because in the last 10 years there has been a lot of discussion whether the North-South divide within the European Union is perhaps replacing the East-West one, right? It's really the southern countries of the continent, Italy perhaps above all, but also Greece, of course, that have lost out in quite a massive fashion in recent decades. You may know that Poles of our generation, so people in their 20s and 30s, have better life chances than Italians, for instance, right? And if you now compare what these countries look like in the 1980s, Italy being one of the most developed countries in the world and converging very fast with Western standards, whereas Poland was really miserably poor at the time, this is really striking, a really striking illustration of the transformation, right? That an Eastern European country has, in that sense, at least for our generation, overtaken a Western one. And in that sense, I think Zielonka's argument is very, in a way, provocative, but is also very thoughtful. And in fact, these are the kind of provocations we need. Now, having said that, I do think that the East-West division matters. And the question really is then, on what level does it matter? Is it a discursive problem? Is it a material kind of problem? Is it a political problem? And this is what many of the other essays try to discuss.
Mm-hmm. And so it's hard to sort of get at the complexity without going in any sort of detail or in any sort of deep look at these countries. I think this is what a lot of people, especially perhaps in the United States, might struggle with when they're teaching courses. You have this massive event in 1989, and it's actually really events. I mean, it's taught in sort of a monolithic way, like the Berlin Wall falls and then things are over. But really, there's things happening in Hungary sooner than the Berlin Wall, and so that presents a sort of distinct challenge. One thing I like about the volume is that it really highlights nations like Czech Republic or Czechia now, I guess I should say, and contrasts them and compares them to nations like Poland, like you just did. One of the interesting things brought up is religion and this identitarianism, or how people are identifying, in some ways, how the East is more Western than the West.
Yes. Again, one thing that comes up a lot in the volume is that the West can be defined in two very different ways. One as a kind of liberal, democratic, open space, right? A kind of normative project of the West, as Winkler, the German historian, calls it. But of course, the West also has racial, ethnic connotations. And one of the interesting things is that the Eastern Europeans, when they are integrating into the West, they also adopt a lot of the kind of far-right visions of the West and the far-right visions of Europe, right? If you look at, for instance, the Hungarian government, but also several other Eastern European governments, and you explore how they have reacted to the refugee or migrant crisis of 2015, you see that there's actually a lot that they take from the Western far-right. The mobilization against immigration, and these are not really countries where you have mass immigration at all. This is really rather a phantom enemy. But the migrant or refugee crisis of 2015 made these governments able to mobilize anti-migrant sentiments in countries where this was really not the case ever before to that extent. And that's what one of my colleagues, Janos Panayiotis, has written about, that nowadays you tend to assume that when it comes to migration, Eastern European countries are sort of more rejectionist, they are kind of more closed societies. But historically, maybe the opposite has been the case for the longest time in the modern period. Actually, it is the Western countries that were very much restricting immigration. And most of these Eastern European countries didn't, because not that many people wanted to move to them, right? So there was also not a particular push arising in relation to mass immigration. So that is, I think, a very important perspective to add. But one thing I wanted to perhaps mention quickly is that, of course, we are dealing with an asymmetrical relationship. When I teach about Eastern Europe, I start my course here on the bachelor level here at the University of Maastricht. I start with texts about Orientalism and how the image of Eastern Europe fits, or perhaps doesn't fit so much, into the story of Western Orientalism. And this is the way I start, because then I want to surprise my students. At the end of the class, I tell them, look, but what if the image of the West is so much more important in Eastern Europe than the other way around? And I deeply believe that that is the case. I often tell students, and they tend to laugh, by the way, when I mention this, that, Polish elections are often decided on questions such as, do we want to be like the Netherlands, right? Questions such as, do we want to legalize abortion, or do we want to allow homosexual marriage? Questions of that sort, which are settled in Western Europe, are really controversial questions in some of these Eastern countries. And the debate is, do you want to be more like the West or not? Whereas in the Netherlands, it's unimaginable practically that an election between parties would be decided on how do we relate to what is happening in Poland. Poland is simply not that important, right? So there is that asymmetry in the relationship, and also asymmetry in the amount of knowledge about each other, right? Eastern Europe is in many ways the half of Europe, which is less often discussed, which is less present in the mind, also globally, right? I mean, when we talk about Europe, we very often focus almost exclusively on Western Europe.
And that asymmetry can be followed almost, from immediately 1989, people leaving the East.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so that has significant effects on both the economy and the population, and the voting for sure. The population shift is an interesting sort of thing there. You talk about walls. Your contributors talk about walls in multiple forms. We have, of course, the Berlin Wall falling and East flooding West. And then we also have the Hungarian-Serbian immigration wall, keeping out this sort of open arms policy that Europe wanted to have, Europe being Germany, in the immigration crisis. So how are these population shifts changing the story since 1989?
Yes, that's an absolutely crucial aspect. The largest percent of immigrants from countries are really, if you look at the European ranking today, the top countries are all Eastern European. Masses of people have left these countries to move to the West. And I think the British story is really the most interesting there, right? Also, because this is perhaps not that well known globally speaking, Britain, despite the fact that Britain was never part of the Schengen zone, Britain allowed the immigration of workers immediately when these countries joined, because they believed in something like the freedom of movement, right? In that respect, and they also, they thought that was a kind of fine liberal principle at the time. So you have, and Germany, for instance, didn't, right? Germany at the time restricted labor immigration for 7 years. Right, this is the early 21st century. This is very ironic, I think, to recall, because nowadays we tend to assume, that Germany is much more open and Britain is kind of, anti-immigration. I think the Brexit campaign actually comes very much on top of this, history where millions of people come in, and we have a conversation at the end of the volume between Peter and Igor Pomerantsev, father and son. I mentioned it the other way around. I mean, Igor is, of course, the father. And they discuss this, I think, in a very interesting way, because they say that what you have in Western Europe is of course, mass immigration at the time of decolonization, but people who moved to Britain at the time, in a way, confirmed to the British their superiority, because many of the former colonial subjects who then moved to Britain after decolonization relates to the English in a very specific way. And now for Eastern Europeans, the difference is that they don't particularly look up to the British, and they are fairly similar to them. And that's what Peter Pomerantsev argues, I think, in a very, very interesting way, that the shock for the British is that they are not that different from Eastern Europeans. They want to see themselves as very special, as a kind of unique nation with an extraordinary political culture and, historical achievements and so on. But in fact, if you look at people, they are fairly similar to the Poles or the Latvians or the Romanians. And this is something that this is an idea that many, many people in Britain seem to deeply resent and kind of revolt against. And I think, the Brexit campaign is, to some extent, that, successfully achieved this referendum victory is a consequence of that.
And it's interesting. There are a few of the contributors who do dig back. I mean, beyond 1989, and the sort of, like you said, you start with Orientalism. I mean, how deep is this us versus them, East versus West, ingrained in sort of both Western and Eastern European minds?
Right. I think what is very interesting is that, for Eastern Europeans, the idea of Eastern Europe is not really an idea they can identify with. Benjamin Schenk, whom I'm sorry to say we don't have in the volume, but he has written a brilliant article when he basically explained that none of these Eastern European people really take Eastern Europeanness as a positive self-identification. They all prefer to either use it as a kind of term of mockery, or basically identify their own Eastern neighbors with the East, right? So the Hungarians would say, well, Romania is Eastern Europe. The Austrians would say, well, look, Hungary is Eastern Europe. The Germans would say, look, Poland is Eastern Europe. So that kind of thing, right? So it's kind of always your next neighbor who's more Eastern than you are, but not you yourself, because you kind of belong. So that is that. But of course, in Western Europe, there is, I think, still a sense that there is a kind of border to Western Europe, and Eastern Europe is somehow different. And this is, I think, the story we are trying to trace, right? How come that after 1989, both sides of the continent, who otherwise didn't know each other that well, who had many misperceptions about each other, and who also in many ways resented each other, could come together and form the European Union and kind of have this enlarged Europe of 28 member states, and why that project turned out to be really fraught and by now, of course, also really very much in crisis, partly because of this. So, what was it after 89 that made the Western Europeans think that it will be relatively easy and inconsequential, in a sense, to integrate a lot of new member states from Eastern Europe? And what made the Eastern Europeans think that they would benefit so much from integrating with the Western Europeans? Because this was really the consensus in the 1990s. And I think what we see in more recent years is that these sort of illusions that were attached to the reunification process of the continent as they conceived of it, right? I mean, it wasn't really a reunification, since the continent was never quite unified before in this way, but it was presented as a reunification. That this process actually hasn't quite delivered on its promises.
Yeah, and that sort of like idea that, okay, well, now we're done with this communist system, we can move on to a capitalist Western style democracy and have all the things that we didn't have before. We can finally have the materials and stuff. Can you talk a little bit about the sort of disappointment or disillusionment that leads to, and how that affects the political situation in the East?
Yes, right. So I think we have several very interesting essays on that. I mean, Jaroslav Kuiš is one of the contributors who focuses really on the myth of the West. And you may know Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes have published a volume recently, which also addresses what they call the imitation imperative. So the idea is that after 89, when the Soviet regimes implode, nobody really quite knows where these countries will go, because it's a kind of unprecedented process. But then they have a kind of vision of the West. They know where they want to arrive. They want to be like normal Western societies, right? Liberal democracies, with a free market economy, quite some social welfare, that kind of package that they identify with the West and with Western Europe in particular. They also want to have, and they want to get there relatively fast. So basically, the West becomes a normative idea for these Eastern European countries after 89. But they don't really know Western Europe that well. They don't also quite realize that Western Europe is also going through a period of crisis and a period of reform, neoliberal reforms in particular. And so until they join the EU, they have a very rosy, very idealized image of the West and also the European project. And once they join, a certain disillusionment sets in, because they really don't realize that these are real places with real people and real conflict. So they somehow think of them as ideal types. And that's what is, and I find it absolutely fascinating. I often say that if you compare Eastern Europe 15 years after 89, so that is 2004, that's exactly the moment when most countries joined the EU. That is a moment when most of these countries look like well-functioning liberal democracies. they also have populations which are very pro-European and very pro-West, but also they don't really know the West from personal experiences, and very few people in these countries at that time spoke foreign languages well enough. Now, when you look at today, the exact opposite is the case. Now, we're 15 years later, in 2019, we have a whole generation now of younger people who know a lot of countries of the West and around Western Europe. They have lived in various places, they made friends all across the continent. They speak several languages, very often quite well. And at the same time, the countries have shifted away from the liberal democratic mainstream, what used to be the mainstream 15 years ago, and they have sort of become much more skeptical towards the European project. So I think that's a very, very interesting paradox, right? That how this opening to Europe actually results in a political turn against the idea of imitating the West.
And one of the ways that you really see that is through, as you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, through this gendered perspective. The idea that, now that communism has fallen, we are going to have this growth in human rights, sort of freedom has arrived. But in a lot of ways, it works in the opposite for women, as certainly in representative forms. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. Again, we put a lot of emphasis both on the dissident legacy in Eastern Europe and also the gender dimension of that. We have several essays that explain, and I think Robert Brill has really contributed a brilliant piece, which he has, again, published a few years earlier already, which is very much about the gender ideology, if you wish, of the Eastern European dissidents, right? The people who in the West have often been presented as kind of great democratic heroes, Václav Havel, Adam Michnik, or György Konrad in Hungary, they were really heading, in a sense, movements, very influential movements that were very much based on a kind of patriarchic notion, and that very much rejected what they call gender ideology. Right? They thought, because they were against ideology as such, they were against the communist ideology, they also thought that feminism was somehow very ideological, and they didn't want to have much of it. And in fact, their own milieux. So if you look at, the dissident milieu of Hungary, of Czechoslovakia, and so they were very, very much dominated by men, and women played very marginal roles in them. So in that sense, the dissident tradition that is so much loaded in the West as kind of the best of Eastern Europe is very gender biased. Now that's one thing that the volume, I think, shows very nicely. But then there is also another element to it, which is what Barbara Falk's essay is about. It's not so focused on gender, but it's focused on the lessons that are drawn from this dissident heritage. And she tries to show that one of the big problems after '89 is that basically there's an idea that the revolutions were spontaneous and they happened to sort of come up with a recipe of democratization on the spot. This is what she calls the narrative from that kind of leads us from Berlin to Baghdad, right? That basically the end of the Cold War in the West is perceived as the spontaneous victory of the people, and then the belief spreads that you could kind of do regime change and democratize societies almost instantly. And what Barbara Falk then shows is that, in fact, in Eastern Europe, nothing was spontaneous, that these revolutions were very well prepared over a long time. There was a lot of political learning over the decades under communism, and then there was also sort of social trust in these milieu that played a crucial role in enabling '89, right? So we actually have to look at the history of dissent in a very different way, not to make this kind of mistake that democratization can be just sort of imposed or kind of can erupt from one moment to the next.
Yeah, it's a good warning, I think, to a lot of people, and especially once again, I see us being drawn past 1989 and into the future. And I think a lot of your contributors are kind of tempted and do this. I mean, it's useful to kind of consider how long these roots of alternative ideas, I guess you could say, have happened. Now, you have this really sort of memorable idea in the volume of longing for the past reflects the present. And so we see like this, people would, if you can just log on to Twitter or any, online forum where academics are, and you can see this sort of uncertainty about the future. And then there are people who are very certain, who are kind of looking towards the past. What role does the past have in the East, in the present and the future now? Like, is there a sort of memory? Yeah.
I think what happens is that, you have 89 is both a liberal democratic revolution, but it's also for many of these countries a moment when they want to reconnect to their national histories. And what happens after 89, and I think that's really one of the most controversial questions today, is that they see the Soviet period as a kind of a-national or even anti-national period, which doesn't really quite belong to their proper national histories. And because of this interpretation, because of this reading of the recent past, these countries often want to connect to their past from before, right? So when it comes to the country I happen to come from, right, the Hungary, there's a preamble to the new constitution of the country, which says that Hungary lost state sovereignty in 1944 and only regained it in 1990. So basically, those decades were not really part of sovereign Hungarian history, and we, in a way, after 1990, we're trying to reconnect to what was there during the Second World War and right before, which is, of course, a kind of catastrophic idea from my point of view, because Hungary was, as you know, a deeply anti-Semitic state at the time, and also part of the Axis coalition, and fought on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union, and so on. So of course, it's really, I think, an extremely problematic reading. But this is, again, it happens in a way simultaneously with the liberal democratic turn, that there's a kind of new rise of nationalism. And I think nowadays what is very, very interesting, and I'm very puzzled by this, is that we live in a much more open Europe, right? People move a lot more. I mentioned this slightly earlier. Also, the economies of Eastern European countries are very transnationalized. For instance, again, if you look at just Hungary, Hungary happens to be one of the most transnational economies in the world, because Hungary didn't have local capitalists. They built capitalism without capitalists. So basically, almost all the capital that is invested in the country comes from abroad, right? So that's really extraordinary in a way. And nevertheless, you have a politics which is kind of very narrowly national, and it seems to dominate the country now for quite a while. So this discrepancy between the socio-economic reality and then the political hegemony of a kind of right-wing nationalist project, I think is really, really striking, and I don't think anybody can quite explain it.
Do you think this sort of nationalist, creating this national identity would prevent someone from, if you have a comparable job in, say, Hungary and Germany, would it prevent someone from Hungary moving to Germany? Is that nationalist idea strong enough to keep people? Is that one of its goals?
That's one of the very interesting things, that I think nationalism is resentful, because many people in Eastern Europe feel that they are sort of second-class citizens within Europe, right? Nominally, we are all equal, but Fidesz, which is the governing party of Hungary, they have all these campaigns about how they should respect us, and I think these campaigns resonate because people feel that they are not being respected enough. That they have, by 2004, they should have been accepted as perfectly equal members or citizens of Europe. But that hasn't quite meant that the socioeconomic, levels of opportunity or levels of basically wealth has caught up. So, that's of course one of the big ironies, that what happens in Eastern Europe after 89 is a democratization attempt at a time of a deep socioeconomic crisis, right? I think in the West, we tend to think of 89 as a moment of liberation, which it clearly was. I think in many ways it was a very, very significant moment of human liberation. But it was also a moment of socioeconomic collapse. And I think we have to think of the two together, right? Western Germany or Italy managed to democratize after 45 because their economies were growing at an unprecedented rate. Now, what happens in Poland, in Hungary, in Romania, and so on, is that the early years of liberal democracies are extremely difficult. They are actually, these countries are doing worse socioeconomically than before. And that's, I think, what we see today, that there's a kind of long-term impact of that. Basically, what you have now after 30 years is that people realize in these kind of peripheral states of Europe that they haven't quite gotten much closer to the core countries, right? The difference between the Netherlands and Hungary today is practically as large as it was in 1989. So in that sense, this project of convergence, right, the big hope of Eastern Europeans that they would converge with the West, it has worked out institutionally, but it hasn't quite worked out in everyday life.
Interesting. And you've now seen these things firsthand. You've studied them as an academic at the top level. I'll sort of force you into a box that historians hate to be. The next 15 years, the next 30 years, are you hopeful or cynical?
In general, or about Europe in specific?
In about this East-West divide, the legacy of division, is it something that can be overcome? Or is Hungary always going to be less than Netherlands, right?
Yes. I tend to think that the story is that after 89, we thought that this division can be overcome, and now we have become much more realistic. You know, because basically what happens after 89, we like to say that all the differences between Eastern and Western Europe are due to the Cold War. It's only in those 4 decades that these major differences were created. But in fact, the story is not really that. If you look at it historically, if you look at it in the long term, you realize that the differences between Eastern and Western Europe go back much, much further in time. They go back centuries. So I don't think it's quite realistic to expect the 2 halves of the continent to substantially grow together in a short period of time. Now, again, some countries or some pockets of Eastern Europe may succeed, and I think some have already succeeded. Some parts of Poland, some parts of the Baltics look very modern, very developed in an all-European, even on an all-European frame. But the large, I think, majority of places haven't quite gotten there. And the time lag, so to say, to Western Europe is very, very substantial. Because the project of kind of creating modern societies, where people have independent wealth, where they're quite independent of the state, and so on. This is a process that goes back 300-400 years in the Netherlands, at least, if not more. I think its roots go back even further. Now, these processes have started much, much more recently in Eastern Europe. And I think if you take the long-term view, we realize that any quick convergence is an illusion. It will certainly take quite long for this to happen.
And for countries that are sort of on the periphery of this, that don't have that success of Poland, who are just struggling to get by, you could say it's perhaps Georgia, where they're still teetering, and they're in, sort of difficult places in Europe as well. Do you see them going further to the right or just sort of polarizing? What do you have in store for those countries?
I think what's very interesting is that there are these countries that have not made it into the European Union yet, but that are very eager to come closer, right? I think Georgia is a good example for that. Also, of course, we have the same issues in the Balkans, right? Countries like Albania, North Macedonia, Montenegro, they would be very eager to become part of a further enlarged Europe. What is interesting there is that I think the willingness on the side of Western Europe is lacking at the moment, right? I mean, of course, we had recently this quite shocking intervention when the enlargement negotiations were again kind of called off, and the enlargement prospects were postponed. And that's partly because the Western Europeans feel that they have given a lot to Eastern Europe, they have shown a lot of goodwill towards Eastern European countries, and things somehow haven't quite worked out, right? So when you have countries like Poland and Hungary in the Union, and they're doing the kind of very problematic they have very problematic foreign policies, but they also have very problematic internal policies. I think many Western Europeans feel that maybe this enlargement was premature, and maybe one shouldn't rush to include more countries. And that I think is very devastating, if you wish, for countries like Georgia or countries in southeastern Europe, because I think Europe would still be able to stabilize them and give them a certain framework where they could no longer quite go in a fully authoritarian direction, right? That's in a way also the experience, I think, with Poland and Hungary, that even though they have really right-wing populist governments and they have weakened the checks and balances in the system, they haven't become fully authoritarian because the European Union wouldn't allow that. They could no longer claim full membership if they did that. So the EU, in a way, constrains them.
Hmm. All interesting points. And it's interesting too to see this sort of like periphery mirrored in sport. Now the listeners might not know that you're also an expert of sorts in sport, and
Yes.
I've had the pleasure of watching soccer matches, football with you. And you
That's
look at the Champions League final 16 here, and they're all they're all teams from Italy, Germany, France, and you don't see Eastern European representation.
exactly.
It's a very similar divide. Is the Europa League always going to be sort of the place for the East?
That's an absolutely fascinating question. I follow two sports in particular: football, or what you call soccer, across the Atlantic, and tennis. And I think it's very interesting because in football, you're really right that on the club level, in terms of club competitions, Eastern Europeans have practically disappeared. None of them really quite have the money and the resources to compete on the highest level. The Champions League is basically competition between the 5 major countries of Europe, which are, of course, England, France, Italy, Spain, and Germany, and to some extent Portugal and the Netherlands. Right? They have good teams with Porto, with Ajax. But they are of course also Western European. None of the Eastern European countries is able to compete. The only way that there's a kind of Eastern European connection, which one might mention, is of course through Russian oligarchic money, which is of course behind some of the British teams such as Chelsea. But the interesting thing is that in tennis, something completely different has happened. Tennis, which is considered, somehow an elite sport, at least, the image of it is such. There, if you look at the rankings, both among the men, but especially among the women, Eastern Europeans are absolutely dominant. And I find that story really, really striking, right? How after 89, in this process of westernization, the kind of westernmost sport, if you like, which is tennis, right? This kind of elite sport, the Eastern Europeans happen to take it extremely seriously and start to compete in that sport on the highest level and start to be the best. I mean, I think the best player in the world, despite not being number one at the moment, is Novak Djokovic, right? And also among the women, I mean, it's one after another. And even the people who represent Western European countries, such as the Swiss player Martina Hingis or Wozniacki from Denmark, they happen to come from Eastern Europe, right? Also Monica Seles, who was an American player, or Navratilova, they were all from Eastern Europe, from Yugoslavia, from Czechoslovakia, and so on, right? So that's extraordinarily interesting, I think.
Yeah, and I think those cultural sort of aspects of life just offer such insight. And now, how much of that, though, is holdover from pre-1989? Now, when I was in undergrad, I played in an orchestra full of musicians from Bulgaria who had grown up under the Soviet system, but that doesn't necessarily seem to have faded away. I mean, Eastern Europeans are still, outnumbering sort of the West in success in music in a lot of ways.
Yes, no, that's absolutely. So, in sports, there was really a serious competition during the Cold War, and the Eastern European countries were really there to win a lot of medals. Hungary is, happens to be a country which is very proud of its Olympic record. I think Hungary still is among the top 10 countries in the world in terms of number of gold medals won, which is kind of crazy if you think about how small Hungary is, right? And how sort of insignificant in many other ways the country happens to be. But in sports, this was really always a kind of big compensatory thing, right? To be best at something. But also I think during the Cold War, there was always a kind of sense that, the big money sports, the sports where there was real attention, where you could really broadcast it and millions of people would watch it, those were the sports where the Westerners would win, and the Easterners would win at sports where a lot of labor had to be put in. Things where, you didn't make big money, you didn't become a big global superstar, and it was really tough to make it, but they competed and they won, right? So this kind of labor intense and quite exploitative sports, the Eastern Europeans, again, I don't mean to denigrate that. I think it's a fantastic achievement to be a world-class swimmer, but it's not going to give you the kind of exposure of a basketball player, right, or of a soccer superstar. So that's what Eastern Europeans were so great at. So there is that legacy of being on the highest level in the world in sports. But that's why I think tennis is so fascinating, because tennis, you would expect to be exactly that kind of Western sport, and there the Easterners have really, really succeeded.
And so now, I mean, you've been looking back at 1989. Obviously, 2019 was this 30th anniversary year, and it's very much part of your teaching and research. What other projects are you working on, and what does 2020 have in store for you?
Yes, you see, I come in a way from intellectual history, and I come from Jewish studies to a large extent. And I wanted to maybe make one perhaps perplexing or surprising remark about that. Because, when I was young, I was extremely interested in the Hungarian Jewish story, very tragic story, but also in many ways an extremely fascinating piece of history. And when I was working on this book now about 89 and the legacy of division, East and West after 1989, I realized that basically the story I was looking at, the Jewish story of trying to integrate into Hungarian society, trying to some extent to assimilate, and the question of to what extent they succeeded or failed at that, why they were accepted or rejected by non-Jewish people. This is very, very similar to what we as Eastern Europeans have been living through when I was young, right? We were also in a way trying to be like the West. We were trying to integrate into some kind of Western structures. So in fact, what seemed to me, when I was doing that as a young person, what seemed to me, kind of a very, very, tragic and fascinating piece of history was actually very much the contemporary reality around me. And I never quite realized that at the time. Only now when I'm a bit older and I worked on this project, did I realize that there are actually very striking similarities. Right. But so having said that, I am an intellectual historian who's very interested also in Holocaust historiography and how that has evolved, right? How our knowledge and also discussions about the Holocaust have changed over time. And I'm trying to write a big project. And that's also why I was in the US earlier this year about Randolph Braham, who was the leading historian of the Holocaust in Hungary and who has really been active since the early 1950s as a researcher all the way until his death last year in 2018. And he has left behind a massive personal archive, which allows me to again write, I think, the biography of a fascinating person, but also I can really reflect on the evolution of Holocaust studies more generally.
And
so that's my plan also for next year. And again, it might take me much longer than just 1 year, I'm afraid.
Yeah, it sounds like an absolutely massive project, but a fascinating one. And we will definitely have to have you back on Hour of History once that project becomes more and more closer to finished. Now, unfortunately, we're drawing towards the end of our podcast here, but it means we get to make a suggestion for the listeners of the Hour of History podcast. They are all over the world. We have people tuning in from the UK, from the Netherlands, from Hungary, from China, from Australia, all over the world. And I'm sure they've been very interested to hear about this legacy of division. Europe has been on a lot of people's minds. But is there anything you'd like to suggest to these people?
Again, if I can make one big suggestion, I would say, don't spend too much time online, explore the world, go out and see things for yourself. I think we live in an age, when online kind of, algorithms and so on define a lot of what we do, how we experience the world. And I think if we want to have, kind of real knowledge, we need to sort of go beyond what is recommended, what is suggested to us, what is kind of pre-packaged. I have to say, I think I've learned the most in my life by being a kind of intelligent tourist, if you wish. Travel around. Don't take too many planes because that's very bad for the environment. But travel around, go to interesting corners of the world, and make sure to go also into the neighborhoods which the tourist guidebooks or the online websites don't recommend, because that's where you find, I think, really interesting, kind of small treasures, and that's where you can really understand the complexity of the world we live in.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. It's funny because the podcast relies so much on online sort of interaction, and people become lost in that sort of thing, and it's easy to just totally forget the world outside of you. It is kind of this dystopian world that is created if people do that. So I think that's a fantastic suggestion. My suggestion is kind of similar to that. I'm going to suggest that you go to sporting events, because what a great place to learn about it. Even if you don't like sports, or you're not a passionate fan of whatever sport that you happen to be going to watch, the amount of sort of like you coined the term intelligent traveler, the amount of sort of information that I've learned from attending a soccer match in Northeast China, and then attending one in Eastern Europe, it's just fascinating. From what they sell at the concessions, you can do like a food history sort of analysis, to what the people are yelling in the crowd. Even if you don't speak the language, you can kind of figure it out. So I think you'd do well to follow Ferenc's advice and unplug a little bit, and then maybe that'll get you to a sporting event. So great. Is there anything you'd like to add before we sign off here?
No, I think that's it. That's really a wonderful suggestion from your side, and thank you so much for having me on the show. It's been a great pleasure talking to you.
Absolutely. Ferenc Laczó is one of the editors of this new volume, The Legacy of Division, East and West After 1989. And more information and links to that are at hourofhistory.com. Thanks so much for joining us on Hour of History. It's our world, anytime, any place. So long.
Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out our recommendations page at hourofhistory.com/recs. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. There you'll find links to the books mentioned during the podcast, and if you choose to purchase one, you'll be supporting the podcast in the process. And if you still haven't gotten your fill of the Hour of History, make sure you head over to the Hour of History blog, found at hourofhistory.com/blog, with articles being released fairly often on topics relating to those covered in the podcast, as well as others. With that, we conclude this episode and hope to have you back for the next one. Take care, and again, thanks for listening to the Hour of History podcast.